So today I am here at Rock Cut State Park. This is one of my favorite parks. I'm out here several times a week running around. And one of the things I love coming here is it's a great collection of different trees. And if you're ever out in the woods and trying to figure out what tree is that, what plant is that, we're gonna go over a few different things today where you can look at the leaves, the bark, the nuts, and see what kind of tree might it be. Now I do have to say, I am in northern Illinois, and so I'm going to be looking at most of the regular trees you would find around here. There are a few odd transplants, but most of the trees are going to be things I find around here, and you're going to find different things in your area. So I want to kind of show you what I might find and what I look at, but then we're also going to go back to the office and take a look at some of the resources I find to learn more about what's around me. Okay, this is a fun one. This is actually poison ivy, and it's kind of fun because it comes in a lot of different types. There are 60-some different varieties of poison ivy, but most of them have these 3 petals on the one leaf. And you can see that the center one kind of has 2 thumbs. The center one here has 2 thumbs, but the outside one just has a thumb on the outside, so it looks like a mitten this way, and the other one looks like a mitten that way, and the one in the middle looks like it has a mitten both ways. That's poison ivy. Up here we have an oak tree that isn't doing very well, and it actually has a grapevine growing in it. But this is a fairly common design for a red oak. You can tell it's a red oak because the leaves, the tips actually come to a sharp point. White oak, they get rounded, but the red oak ones, they all have the sharp point on it. Red oak acorns also have these tops that just kind of like hold onto the top. They don't come down very far. Whereas with white oak, the tops actually come down a lot farther on the acorn itself. Whereas this is a white oak. This is actually a white oak, and you can still see it has some vines on it. But a lot of the branches have these small branches coming off of them. And you often see a lot of growth on the main branches as well. That's not very common on red oaks, but a lot of white oaks, especially bur oak and swamp oak, you'll see the limbs covered. Whereas this is a white oak leaf, and you can see the rounded tips on this. Here's another branch of them. And as you open them up, you can see all of the tips actually come to a rounded point as opposed to a sharp point. There's something incredibly beautiful about looking up into the canopy of trees, especially with all these white oaks. They're just beautiful. Here's a beautiful example of a swamp oak. You can see these very broad leaves, similar to a bur oak, but a bur oak tends to be thinner down here. It is a type of white oak because it has these rounded corners. And here's a closer look at the acorn on the tree. You can see how the cap covers often more of the actual acorn. And you will see growth all the way along the branch. Sometimes with these trees, you'll see the very outsides of them have died off, and sometimes that's actually a signal that they have been overwatered, which, yes, we have gotten a ton of rain this year, and the very outside edges of the trees die off. Even on this really well-developed red oak, you can see how a lot of the outside limbs have died off. It's been a very, very wet year this year. Now, this bark, if you're used to pine trees, you'll see this and you'll think, oh, this is some sort of pine. Then this one, the bark on it looks kind of like a pine tree, but those aren't pine needles. And then you got fruit that looks like this, and these leaves. This is actually an alder. But then you have trees that look like this, and you really don't see any leaves on them other than other things that are growing on them. That is actually called a dead tree. One of the reasons I love coming out here in the fall, just before things start to turn, is you get to see more. You get to see the nuts and the fruit, you get to see the leaves, you get to see the bark, you see them on the ground, you see them in the trees, and you get to identify what those trees are. Whereas in the winter, when all the leaves and fruit are gone, all you really have is the bark and maybe a little bit of the tree structure, and sometimes that can get very hard to identify things. But at different times of year, you're going to see different things in the tree. And so sometimes it's good to come out at different times and just get to know the trees around you. There are a few stands of pine trees in my area, but firs and pines, unfortunately, I'm not quite as good at those. I don't use them quite as much, and so I haven't learned those trees as much. Plus, there aren't that many of them in my area as compared to the deciduous trees. But one that I do know is the white pine, because I like white oak as well, and white pine is what I prefer for a Christmas tree. And here are the needles from it, and you can see they come in these clusters of 5 needles, which make them easy to identify because white has 5 letters, W-I-T-E. Here's a closer look at the white pine needles. One of the best Christmas trees in my book. I love working with them. Incredibly soft. When you think of birch, a lot of people think of a white tree, but this right here is actually birch. Not all birch are paper birch. Here are some other birches, and those ones look a little more classical with the paper on them. That's probably one of the easiest trees to identify by its bark, is the birch. Now here's a really fun one. That big tree back there, that's probably about 4 foot in diameter, and they usually end up being very, very, very tall trees. But underneath, you'll find these really crunchy, big leaves. And when you go walking through them, they're a very distinctive, very thick, crunchy leaf. The bark has these very large, heavy ridges. This is a cottonwood tree, and sometimes in the spring you'll see all the cotton in the air from them. A lot of carvers love to use the bark from them, but the wood is actually a type of poplar, and so it's a very, very, very soft wood, though it's still a hardwood. Here's another collection of cottonwoods. They're incredibly tall, incredibly large trees, and the leaves don't really change color. They get a little whiter and they just kind of fall off. This is a box elder, which is actually, oddly, a type of maple. And yes, you can get maple syrup out of it. I've done it in the past, and it's a rather nutty syrup. But each leaf is actually these 3, that's 1 leaf. The grain on the bark is very, very easy to spot. And a lot of times I'll be running through the woods, even in the winter, and I'll see that grain, it just stands out as box elder. This fun little one here is one of my favorites. This is actually a hickory tree. The leaves are larger and they come in these clusters. Much like a walnut, this is all 1 leaf from the hickory tree. And in the fall, you'll find these things that come enclosed, and inside you'll find the hickory nut. Just make sure when you serve them to a doctor and you make a daiquiri out of them, you tell them that's a hickory daiquiri, doc. When it comes to the bark, you'll often see it kind of shagging off like this, and you'll sometimes hear it referred to as a shag hickory because the bark just kind of splits off of it. And if you're ever running through the forest, you'll see a lot of these on the ground. They can become a trip hazard until they all break apart. This one here is an ash tree. They're a little hard to identify sometimes, though the bark can be a little bit distinctive. You can see how the leaves have that grouping on them, kind of like a walnut or a hickory tree. This is actually an elm tree, and a lot of people think, oh no, elms are extinct or they're about to be extinct, it's kind of like with ash. But no, there's going to be a lot of them that survive the Dutch elm disease and the emerald ash borer. Here's a closer look at the distinctive sawtooth leaves, easy to spot once you get used to the outline. Here's a fun, ultra distinctive one. This is a hackberry tree, and this bark is just easily recognizable. It stands out. Now I'd love to show you the leaves, but unfortunately the closest ones are up there. So yeah, I just identify it by the bark because the leaves actually look a lot like, elm leaves. Here's another fun distinctive one. This is actually cherry bark. It looks like pine, but no, that's actually a cherry tree. I'd love to give you a closer look at these leaves, but they're up there a ways, and I don't really have any good ones on the ground right now. But yeah, that's a cherry tree. Here is a cherry tree a little closer up. But yeah, you can see that distinctive kind of bark that almost looks like a pine tree. This one back in here is one of the most well-developed mulberry trees that I know of. And I absolutely love this one. One of the weird things about them is when they get really big, the leaves closer to the base get very, very big, sometimes 6 to 8 inches across. Whereas a lot of the leaves on the peripheral are only just a couple inches across. Here is another beautiful example of a mulberry tree when it's allowed to grow. Now you often find these winding up through a fence. They are a very wild tree that loves to grow into things, but when they're on their own in the middle here, they actually turn into a rather beautiful tree. So here is the magical black walnut tree that everyone wants to play with. And as you can see, yes, it is very much a myth that nothing grows underneath a black walnut. And if you look down the ground, you'll find all these tennis ball things. These are the black walnuts. They have a very soft, oily husk. But when you break them open inside, that is the actual walnut. And your hands have a very distinctive smell after messing with them. Yeah, did you hear that sound? That was a walnut coming down. They can be very, very dangerous to walk under in the fall. You can see those balls up there. They are way, 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 way up there. And when those things come crashing down, they will hurt you. I've seen quite a few people with some big bruises and bumps from them. So there's a quick walk through one of my favorite places in the world. I love going through the woods and just trying to identify things. And it's kind of a game for me, is I'll look at a tree and say, wait a second, what is that? I don't know what it is. Then I'm gonna look it up and find out what it is. And next time I come by, I'll identify it. And the more things you identify, the more you start to learn and become familiar with the trees around you and what is actually in your area. It's not one of those things you can read a book and learn. You actually have to go out into the field and experience them and get a visual representation for what is a hickory tree, what is a maple tree, and you won't know that until you get in person. So let's actually go back to the shop and I'll take a look at some things that might help you out along your path to learn them quicker. So I'm back here in my front yard, and this is actually a red oak, a type of red oak called a pin oak. And I've got another one in the backyard, and actually there's several of them around, and that is what gave our subdivision its name of red oak, because there are quite a few red oaks in here. I wish they were white, but oh well. But wait a second, what are these? These aren't oak trees. The bark on them looks relatively smooth like a maple, but the leaf doesn't exactly look like a Canadian flag maple. What's going on there? And the back is even slightly fuzzy. So when I don't know, I actually have an app I pull out, and I can pull down a branch and take a picture of it and say, wait a second, what is this? And through the magic of AI, it tells me, oh wait, it's a red maple. And yes, this is actually one I know rather well, but a red maple. Maple comes in a lot of different types. Red maple, silver maple, sugar maple, and the list goes on from box elder to big leaf and beyond. And oddly enough, as long as it's not a sugar maple, it's called a soft maple. Most of them are silver maple, but you get a lot of red maple that are sold as soft maple. Sometimes box elder will even be sold as a soft maple. But rock maple, sugar maple, iron maple, Canadian maple, those are all names for the exact same tree, which is hard maple. Everything else is just a soft maple. Now when it comes to identifying trees, it's one of those skills you can't pick up a book and learn. You can't watch a YouTube video and know. Now yes, I may have shown you a few trees, and those may have been the ones that are relatively common around here, but even in this area, there are a lot of other trees that I didn't mention. And this is just one small corner of the US. And in the rest of the world, there's lots of other trees that I don't even have here. When I first got into it, the only way you could learn is actually getting a book. And what I did is I went to the library and I got a book on tree identification. I literally went into the woods and started trying to match trees to this. And that's kind of hard because you're looking at a tree and you're like, is it this one? Is it this one? And it's not very good for that. The next step up are a couple websites like the Wood Database, and on there you can actually see a wider variety of pictures and get a better idea of what you're looking for. And in that case, usually what you do is you go to the database and you try and find a particular tree, and then you go out in the woods and you see does it match the database. But even then, it's really kind of hard to make the matches. But now we carry around these amazing devices, and there's a couple apps that I use quite regularly. When I want to know, I'll just take a picture of it. There's two particular I'll bring up. One of them is free, PlantNet. This is one that I used to use a lot, and I really like it. It's relatively good, but you're going to get a lot of false flags, and if you scan the same tree multiple times, you might end up getting multiple answers. But it gets you in the ballpark and gives you at least an idea of it. This might be that. The one I've started using most often is Plant App. This one I really like. It's very, very accurate, and it will work on bark, it will work on pieces of leaves, and I have been very surprised at how true it ends up being. And so it's one of those that I've come to trust a little bit more, but you still take it with a grain of salt. You scan a few different things and see if it comes up the same every time. And after doing it multiple times, you'll find that you start to recognize it and you don't need the app anymore. And that's really what it's all about, is training your eye to get used to the forms and factors of trees. I now look at certain trees, and just by the shape of the way they grow, it's like, oh, that's a box elder. It becomes second nature in time. But the only way you can learn that is to do it over and over and over again and check yourself. And that's one of the things I love about going into the woods, is as I'm running through the woods, I'll be looking at trees and identifying them, and then there'll come up a tree, I don't know what that is, and I pull out my app and I'll scan it and be like, oh, great. And next time I'm going through the woods, I'll be identifying and I'll see that tree and be like, oh, I know that one now. And it's one of those things you just have to grow over time. I'll leave a link to all of these resources I've mentioned down below. So if you know any good resources for identifying plants, throw those down below. I'll add them to the list and we'll get a big resource going on here. As well as putting those comments down below does help with the channel. So thank you. You're not only adding to the information, but you're actually adding to the algorithm and helping us grow this channel. Between likes, comments, shares, subscribes, thank you button, you know all those things. They really help out the channel and mean a lot. And if you want to find out more about that, there's links down below, as well as all of these names over here. Those are some of the fantastic, wonderful, benevolent, gorgeous people over on Patreon that are worth way more to me than any walnut tree in this woods. Thank you. Without you guys, we wouldn't be here. We're completely sponsored by you. And without you, these videos wouldn't exist. So if you want to find out more about that, you know what to do. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. And now it's the saddest part of the video where I've got to leave.